We are ready to go. So welcome everyone to our Path to Bridging event for Civic Learning Week. We're excited to have you all here with us. I'm excited to be here with my fellow panelists. During our time together, we'll explore bridge building, which is basically bringing Americans together across differences to listen, understand each other, and discover common ground. This is a relatively new field, although those concepts may sound really familiar to you, and you're probably doing them already in your classrooms. This new field is experiencing tremendous growth and momentum in the face of, and even because of, worrisome statistics around isolation, mental health, and extreme political polarization. Members of the panel were brought together through the Listen First Coalition, which is a group of over 500 organizations dedicated to bridge building. So I'll just set up a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. The Partnership for American Democracy identified 5 sustainable democracy goals, kind of like the Sustainable Development Goals used by the UN and other entities, to renew and revitalize what the Founding Fathers established ahead of our 250th anniversary as a nation. The first goal is civics education, and the third is bridge building. So we have the perfect opportunity today to look at the current need for attention to and potential for collaboration between these two pillars. Schools have long been a place where we socialize norms and learn cultural cues. Increasingly, we see culture wars and political polarization creep into the education community. Today, we'll address this by sharing stories and solutions from diverse positions in K-12 education represented by our panelists. And we'll give you a little bit of the panelists' background here. With us, we have Kanan McKenzie, who is the director of the newly created Generous Listening and Dialogue Center at Tufts University Tisch College of Civic Life. She previously served as the director of the Aspire Institute at Boston University, supporting the pre-K through 12 education sector with professional development opportunities rooted in social justice and community engagement. She has taught courses in research methods and the foundations of education. She has a multinational, multicultural framework that helps shape her approach to education as an immigrant who moved to the United States at the age of 7 and grew up in New York City. Next, we have Eric Shilga, who is an 8th grade English teacher in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and also serves as the school's dialogue coach, which I love that the school has a dialogue coach. He has taught for more than a decade in a variety of Catholic, charter, independent, and public schools, both in the United States and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. In addition to his teaching, he also is the assistant director of Mount Holyoke's Masters in Teacher Leadership program, where he teaches classes on education policy and leadership. In addition to a dialogue, he loves to incorporate his training as an actor and director in order to help facilitate engaging and embodied learning opportunities for students and faculty. Finally, rounding out this illustrious group, we have Kanisha Mahajan, who is currently a senior at Stuyvesant High School in New York, hailing from Queens. In addition to being a podcaster at Next Gen Politics, Kanisha is also a facilitator at Why Vote, an initiative focused on voting rights and voter engagement. Over 2 years with Next Gen and Why Vote, she's come to understand the importance of fostering civil discourse and how crucial these discussions are to creating meaningful change. She's passionate about criminal justice and reform, specifically at bettering the educational disparities, socioeconomic barriers, and infrastructures that uphold the justice system. Outside of Next Gen, she's heavily involved in journalism and using writing as a vehicle for young people to have their voices heard and work toward concrete solutions to systemic injustices. Welcome, everyone. I hope everyone is having a wonderful afternoon. And we will go ahead and jump into these questions for the panelists. Just a note that we will be doing a Q&A after we hear from them. So please put any questions that you have into the chat. After we're able to hear from panelists and ask them questions. We'll be going into breakout rooms of a sort, kind of around these 3 different perspectives. So we have one for youth, one for educators, and one for people who are more involved in the community aspect of the education, the K through 12 sector. So we'll be able to kind of practice a little bit of bridging or trying to understand each other. And we will explain what that's going to look like after we get to hear from our panelists. So if each of you could take about 2 minutes to answer the following. Where are you seeing conflict and polarization show up in the K through 12 space? What issues are you dealing with? And what is one thing you've done to address it? And we will go ahead and start with Kanan, and then we'll go to Eric and then Kanisha.
Well, thank you so much for having us. Thank you for this conversation. In the education space, I serve on our school committee, which is also a school board in other states. That's the name we use in Massachusetts. And I'm also an educator, and I train educators, and I work in higher ed. So I wear many hats that overlap, but my school committee role is where we can hear from constituents to get differing perspectives about how they want us to represent their ideas when we go to make policy decisions or to just discuss issues in the community. You may not often see those being addressed in public because that's not where many people feel comfortable airing their differences. So for example, I've had parents reach out about concerns with regard to how to handle school violence, how to advocate around issues of gun safety. We've also seen issues around the obvious ones, which were vaccine requirements and masking requirements, and even how to address challenges that we're now seeing in buildings after students are re-entering, if you will, from being more remote or having hybrid schedules. So we're just getting a lot of different perspectives about how the school can best address that. And what we try to do is have our budget and have our policies reflect what we think the consensus of the community is. And so we're often in a position where we do have to consider those differing perspectives and to be able to articulate those for our constituents who may or may not choose to do that in a public forum.
Thanks, Kanan. I love this idea of taking in different perspectives. I think that's something that we all do in our personal lives as well. So whether we're working with a school board or educator or a student or just in our personal lives, it's how do we take in these different perspectives in a way that's respectful and understanding. Yeah. Eric.
Thank you so much, Becca, for having me and for facilitating this panel. And thank you to everybody who's on the call today, taking a little bit of time out of your day to have this important conversation. I look forward to sharing a little bit from the classroom perspective. Like Becca said, I'm an 8th grade English teacher here in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And where I see this issue coming up mainly is in the way that different people in different groups are using the levers of power that have long existed in and around schools, both to set the terms of what acceptable conversation is in the classroom, and then also to set some of the costs associated with engaging in conversations that are outside of that frame. And so I think that one of the ways in which I see this conflict arise most in the classroom is actually in silence. The silence in our curriculum, the silence among our students when they're asked to engage in conversations about the ways in which issues like racial justice, criminal justice, gender, sexuality, identity intersect with their lives. When the curriculum has silence in it and when the students and teachers are met with silence in those conversations, that's where I see that coming up. And an example of the levers of power could be that avalanche of curriculum requests, right to know records requests that are filed from concerned parents, book challenges, both posed to the librarian, the district, and also to individual teachers about particular texts in the classroom, some of which have been taught for a very long time and are a very important part of the curriculum and the way in which we seek in the middle school level to help students explore themselves and their identity and their place in the world. And so none of this leads me to shy away from conflict. I think that conflict is, anyone who's been through middle school knows conflict is a defining experience of the middle school years. And I think it's important, even if it's sometimes uncomfortable, to use that as an opportunity for students to kind of explore who they are in relation to one another, their families, their community, their classroom, their classmates, et cetera. But the one thing I would say that I have done, among others, to try to address this issue and create the conditions for conversations to happen in the classroom would be, I'll just give an example of agreements or classroom norms, right? I think a lot of teachers know that norms and agreements are something you can talk about at the beginning of the year with your students to set the ground rules for appropriate conversation. But I found it's more important than ever to come back to those agreements on an almost daily basis to establish what are the expectations that we have for one another in this conversation, in order to keep each other safe enough to take some risks. And just a quick example of how that might work in practice. The other day, we were trying to have a conversation about Colson Whitehead's Nickel Boys. It's a book we actually read along with To Kill a Mockingbird right now in the curriculum. And we were having a conversation about racial identity, and the students were very reticent to share. And so I took a moment to pause and return our focus to one of our agreements, which was that we give each other permission to speak our first drafts, as long as we're also willing to hold each other accountable for the power of our words. And just reestablishing that norm in the classroom in that moment transforms silence into a vibrant conversation. So just continuously returning to those agreements, resetting and revisiting those ground rules, it's really helpful, I think, in this environment.
Thank you. I love the really concrete examples that you gave of what this looks like and what's playing out. Kanisha.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what everyone else was saying. Thank you so much for having me. And I just building on everyone else's responses, I think the greatest way that you see like polarization kind of manifest in the classroom, I think especially in like a high school or middle school classroom, is kind of through two things. One is like on the student side, which I think is apathy. And then one is on more of the educator side, where it's like the curriculum that's being taught itself. I think like recently when it comes to curricula, especially, if anyone's been following what's going on with like AP African American Studies or any similar sort of history curricula, there's a lot of just like censoring that goes on, and especially the way history and like modern events are taught, to the point where sometimes, like even in my government class, we're not able to discuss some like modern issues because they might be too taboo or just, I guess, off grounds for what we're supposed to be discussing. And I think that like spirit of polarization and this kind of like hostility, or at least a hostile like political environment a lot of young people have kind of grown up in, leads to a lot of like apathy when it comes to political discussions, to the point where when you get to a discussion and there's a disagreement, like I think especially for young people, a first instinct is like to give up and be like, oh, do I really want to carry this conversation forward, because it's going to be exhausting, because every single day on the news, every single day when we open our phones, we see some disagreement or something that's just like unproductive in politics. And that kind of, I think, turns a lot of people off of having those discussions in the first place. And then when it gets into the classroom, I think people just aren't willing to engage with other perspectives because it's like, it's difficult. And I think for the most part, school doesn't really foster that way of thinking. It's a lot more about learning the content than being able to engage in those discussions. So I think kind of the hand-in-hand effect of both a curriculum like censoring things, and then also students who, one, aren't willing to engage in certain discussions and aren't in environments that kind of force them to step out of that comfort zone and engage in those discussions, is like very clearly representative. That political polarization, I think, bars us from being able to like have healthy discourse in classrooms.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm wondering if you have, what is your advice, or what would you do to move toward that way of thinking and engaging versus just engaging with the content? Like, how do you, what would that look like to you to have that environment where you think students could engage or educators could kind of start those discussions?
I think what Eric mentioned earlier about community agreements is super important, because I think in order to be able to like develop your own perspectives, you do need to be in a safe space where you're able to get things wrong. You're able to learn new things and develop your own perspective in addition to just like learning knowledge you're supposed to be learning in school. And I think there's also a few things that are like important to remember. The first one, when we're having those conversations, is something that's not really modeled for us young people is listening to understand and not to respond. I think is really important because I think a lot of times in politics, we see a lot of people listening to other people, or they say listening to other people just to be able to put their own views out there. But I think like discussing to understand each other rather than figure out who's right or who's wrong is a spirit that we need to be instilling, I think, more in young people. And also being able to acknowledge that all beliefs are valid, because I think a lot of times people kind of start meshing the person and the belief to kind of an unhealthy extent. And what comes from that is like, we forget that people's life experiences inform their beliefs. And those are things that are kind of concrete and that you can't change. And it's important to recognize that sides, even if you don't agree with them, are valid and deserve to be heard, because when people feel unheard, they're never going to want to say anything. And I think also like a greater spirit of, I guess, curiosity in students is also important, because again, one of the things that polarization does is it makes you kind of, I guess, simplify other perspectives to the point where you're not really understanding the nuances of them. And I think like telling people that it's okay to ask questions and be curious, and I think encouraging curiosity and probing different sides of an issue or a question is super important. So yeah, those are a few, I guess, tips I could give. I would also just say, you know, encourage students to be like kind to each other when having these discussions. I think a lot of people can take a discussion that's meant to be healthy and turn it not healthy really fast. So just, I think, being open to listening and to some extent letting students really drive that conversation is important, and giving students the free space to like really take agency over their education.
I love that. And I think one of the things you mentioned really is sort of a core skill in bridge building or tactic, is being able to ground the discussion when appropriate in personal experiences, and get curious about where people's ideas around an issue come from. So we're all absorbing culture from media, from our families, from our faith traditions, from all of these different places. And schools is one of those places where we pick up on those cultural cues. So getting curious not only about why do you think that, but where does that come from? Like, where did you kind of absorb those messages? And I also love what you said about not seeing this modeled well. And so I want to turn to Kanan. I feel like when we think about school boards these days, or school committees, that it kind of is portrayed like a circus in media. That's just the opposite of what this modeling is that we want to give to students who are learning how to operate in the world and lead out and become our future leaders and involved in the democratic process. So what do we do to address this sort of toxic discourse that we hear about in school board meetings? What should the public know about the limitations of school boards, or what should school boards do to better engage the public?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And it's true that we do have a difficulty modeling this. And I would say if we zoom out a little bit more, our democratic processes don't really encourage it either. The way that we make decisions in our democracy is the majority wins. That means there is an incentive to win and not to come up with decisions based on consensus. Consensus requires more dialogue, more understanding, and coming to more bipartisan or tripartisan decisions. We have a system that favors voting and having the most numbers of votes to bring a cause forward. So with that being the case, I have to say that I can speak to my local school committee in the sense that we try not to force decisions. We are very careful to allow for something to be discussed for as long as it needs to be discussed for everyone to feel comfortable. And so I would say the majority of our decisions are consensus-based. There's also open meeting law. And so the degree to which you can really follow the procedural requirements, it actually helps you to have a healthy school committee. So for example, we are not permitted to deliberate outside of the public space. that means that I'm not going to go and have coffee with you and tell you how I might vote or how you should vote or try to wrangle decisions. Not so much the case at the federal level. But these are the kind of things at the school committee and school board level that I think help us have healthy conversation, because you're watching us ask questions, think through problems together as a group. And we want to be collaborative, and we want to be able to leave that space and be collegial and professional and even friends, and not have to take that outside of the room. So we have those discussions in front of the public. We also have procedural things that we do that permit us to hear the public, but not debate the public. So for example, I had a pretty public moment a couple years ago in my school committee hearing where a member of the public wanted to know how I, as a Black person, was on school committee, and had some pretty interesting questions around my qualifications. And we had to find a way to hear these kinds of biased statements and not engage in a public debate or confrontation. And so when the public offers to speak or signs up to speak, they have 3 minutes, and we are to hear what they have to say for 3 minutes. And our procedures tell us to listen, take note, thank them, and that's it. It was a very tempting moment to want to say, hey, I got a doctorate, and what do you mean, whatever. But at that moment, I honored that agreement that we uphold for our public. I let her say what she had to say for 3 minutes. And then someone came after her who apparently was a member of a white supremacy group, and he had his own opinions about my position as well. And I sat and listened to him do that. And then our president reminded the public of what our agreements are when it seemed to be getting off the rail. And we never engaged in an argument with the individuals. And I think for our school committee, it was a very defining and cohesive moment where we took ownership of that situation by honoring our agreements with the public. We will listen to you. Obviously, if you're engaging in what seems like hate speech or something like that, we'll curb the conversation. But it was done very respectfully by our mayor and the president of our school committee. And so I would even say the shining light of all of that is within a matter of days, the individual who kicked off that exchange apologized. And I don't know that that would have been as fruitful had I engaged in a back and forth and a debate, and I did not honor our agreements. So I think for our community here in Beverly, we had many, many follow-up conversations about how to ensure that we are modeling for each other and our young people what to do when we have a confrontation and when we have to honor the agreements and try to keep the debates civil. So I think for those of us who are elected officials, the onus is on us to remember what we swore to do, and to do that come what may, unless we feel like we need to obviously rein in a conversation, and we can still do that respectfully. So I think that's really important to do. To the degree that we could do that at higher levels of government, it is a little harder, but I think that we have to know that our young people are watching us, and those who might be interested in becoming elected officials are watching us. And it can be discouraging for it to feel like it's a free-for-all, but it truly is not. And we should remind each other of those agreements and help each other to uphold them. And I think when our public comes to engage with us, they'll be more mindful of what those agreements are, because they'll see the way we treat each other and the way that we conduct our business, and therefore feel, I hope, safer expressing their feelings and their perspectives in a respectful way.
I heard a little bit of that, one of the agreements that Eric mentioned about allowing people to have their first drafts. I think that experience that you had. So I feel like sometimes I consider these procedures or the rules to be really restrictive, but what I hear you saying is that in a way they help you to maintain the piece, that the focus isn't on the back and forth. It's, I hear you, I'm taking down notes, we're going to think about it, give everyone time to sort of cool off and reconsider what
Absolutely.
their position is.
And you can't really govern with consensus if you feel like you are on the spot and must respond to someone's inquiry or concern. As a body, one of the things we have to agree to as well is that when a decision is made as a school committee, you no longer have an individual opinion. So I cannot leave the meeting and say to someone, well, I know what we voted, but my vote is this, and I don't agree with them. That is not how procedurally we operate. Once a decision is made as a body, we are to communicate that to our constituents. This is the decision the body has made. Here are the reasons why. If there are questions or concerns, sure, we'll entertain them to make sure we're clear, or whatever the case is. But it also prevents that splitting that can happen that creates more chaos, where you have people leaving a chamber and continuing to disagree, although there was a vote and a decision made. And so those things also help us with our external behavior with the public, to make sure that we speak as a body, and that if there are disagreements, we have those disagreements as a body in public, respectfully, so that we can share our perspectives, but then honor the decision that was made ultimately.
Yeah. I'm going to get to Eric's question. I also want to remind everyone that we're happy to do some Q&A. So if you do have questions, please drop them in the chat for us. Eric, I feel like Kanisha did a great job of sort of lining up what some core skills are in bridge building. She talked about curiosity, about listening, empathy is another one, creating belonging and inclusion, making this a safe place for us to take risks, like you mentioned earlier. So what have you done? How do you see these skills developing in your students? And what have you done to personally foster them? I know you mentioned conversation agreements, but what are sort of those exercises where you see kids recognizing those skills and really leaning into them and practicing them?
Well, thanks for that question. And also just huge props to Kanisha for the work you're doing at Stuyvesant. Your descriptions were just so on point with my experience and values as someone who's a practitioner of dialogue. So it's really affirming to hear you share those things. And Dr. McKenzie, the work you're doing representing your constituents on the school board is so honorable and important. So I just really appreciate also how you really gave a ringing endorsement of the importance of agreements at all levels. I just think if people leave this call with that in their minds, how powerful it can be to reach, to set some agreements and some ground rules for the way we talk to each other. It's really transformative in communities, and you can keep coming back to it. So in answer to your question, as a dialogue coach, I've tried to really integrate the training that I've received from Essential Partners, the organization that sort of introduced me and mentored me in dialogue work, into various aspects of the curriculum in the hopes that it can equip students with the capacity to seek understanding both of their classmates and also of themselves. So the deep listening that Kanisha was talking about, the asking questions to understand and get curious, that's all work that we've tried to embed throughout our school day. We have advisory periods twice a week. Advisory is a nut that a lot of schools have really struggled to crack. Sometimes it kind of just becomes a catch-all for all the stuff that doesn't happen at other points of the school day. We've tried to be really intentional about the way we use advisory to build life skills, help students come together and think about how to work together as a team, and then finally to develop the habits of healthy conversation. And with those three goals in mind, we've put a couple tent poles in the year that sort of serve as culminating moments that we're working towards in advisory. So the first of those is our student-led conversations. Some of the educators on the call probably are familiar with student-led conferences. It's a new, not necessarily new, but it's a different take on the traditional parent-teacher conference model, where the parent and the teacher sit down to talk about the kid behind their back. And then the kids waiting at home for the aftermath, as one of my students called it, where they can clean up all the mess that their teachers and parents made without them in the classroom. So at our school, what we do is we create a structure for a conversation where students are the facilitators. They're at the center of that conversation. And they are the ones not only talking about all the things that they've learned and the ways in which they've grown, but also putting questions to their parents and their teachers about ways that their parents and teachers have felt stretched, challenged, what they're learning as their student has gone through this process in school. So that's one. We spend a lot of time in advisory preparing for that conversation and equipping students at all levels with a script, with agreements, with questions, and with a sense of efficacy when it comes to how they can facilitate those conversations. So there you also have students developing the skill of facilitation. And that's something that a lot of students don't get a chance to do day to day. Their experiences in the classroom are facilitated for them. So to give them a chance to facilitate a conversation with adults, and you would think perhaps with their parents being like an easy first step, but I think a lot of us also know that it's sometimes hardest to have these healthy conversations with the people we're closest to. So it is a real challenge to them. And then the last thing we do at the end of the year, we plan a showcase where in advisory, the students prepare themselves over the course of the second half of the year to chart their progress towards their learning goals, but also to respond to questions about their interests, their passions, their challenges, and then have that conversation not only with their parents, but with other members of the community. And so in that way, we can really use advisory as a time to do more than just get your homework done, and really use it as a time for students to connect with one another and with their teachers, and also to bring the community into those conversations in a way that builds a level of trust that hopefully in the long term can kind of bring down the temperature and some of the sort of disquiet and distrust that's marked a lot of the ways in which members of the community have engaged with schools lately.
Yeah, I really appreciate you kind of drawing out this facilitation as a skill building. I think it gives you confidence when you have a structure, when you have a door opened for you, when you can lean in and practice them. And I think the ultimate goal is that these kinds of behaviors and practices just become normalized and socialized. And so having those structured opportunities, whether it's engaging with your school board, a dialogue club at school, or in the classroom where you're getting to step in and practice, means that then you can start to apply those to the rest of your life. So one of the questions that we got, and I think one of the ways you do this is with these conversation agreements, right? We know the sorts of environments that we can create so people can feel seen and heard, so they can start to spark curiosity and empathy. And so that's the question that we have for the panel, what are these conversation agreements, or what, so maybe kind of going around and listing a couple of the conversation agreements that you feel either are the most empowering or necessary for people to have in place to be able to talk across tension or polarization, or even across the silence that was mentioned before, which I loved that aspect of things, silence in the curriculum and in the classroom. So we will go ahead. I'll start with Kanisha again, and then Eric, and then Kanan.
Yeah, sorry, it's kind of dark in here. I do not know how that happened, but I can share two important things that are like to keep in mind when trying to engage in those conversations. I think the first one would be, like, I guess this is more out of necessity, like for a person that is open to engaging in political dialogue, it's okay to have like a line you draw when you're talking about these things. Like there are some things that you might not want to talk about, or you just don't feel ready to, or extremely like uncomfortable discussing. And I think it's important just like for a person to know where that line is, just so they, again, don't get like discouraged from having these discussions in the future if people do cross those lines. And I think another thing that's important to keep in mind is that you actually got this from a friend in NGP who mentioned this one day, is that you learn most when you're uncomfortable. And I think that's something important to keep in mind, that if you're I think a lot of people like that even do engage in political discourse might find it not as, I guess, fruitful or as enriching, because they're maybe having similar conversations over and over again. And I think a lot of us, it's way easier to agree than it is to disagree, right? So I think when you're able to like disagree with people in a healthy way and maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable, we're growing in those situations, I think, a lot more than people will realize. So it's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes, because in the long run, you'll probably be a bit better for it. So I guess those are two things that are just, I think, important to acknowledge in a conversation. Yeah, and they're good, I guess, discussion agreements to have in your toolkit.
And I think those are also applicable to any time, anywhere situations. Eric.
I think those are great, Kanisha. And I particularly like the comment you made about learning when you're uncomfortable. It's one of the reasons why in my Essential Partners training, we talk a lot about creating safe enough spaces where there's still an opportunity to take risks. And that's part of the learning experience. but we're keeping it safe enough that those risks can be taken with the knowledge that we're going to learn and grow, and try to be aware of any potential harm that we've caused in the process, and repair it. So in terms of agreements, I think that agreements are really situational, and a really powerful part of what you can practice in the classroom is creating, revising, revisiting those agreements based upon what you need. And so I actually happen to just have within reach a copy of this book that we read excerpts from earlier. This is The Importance of Being an Octopus by Anne Braden. And it tells the story of a girl growing up in Vermont, and she has a conversation in one scene in her classroom about gun violence in schools. And they're actually sitting around a table in the library preparing for like a debate about the subject. And in the conversation, she has a very different perspective, experience, background than her classmates, and she kind of gets shut down before she even gets a chance to speak. And so what we'll do with the students is we'll take that excerpt from the story, we'll put it in front of them and ask them, what did Zoe need in that moment in order to be able to speak what was true for her and to be able to represent her experience and her feelings about this topic, because she wasn't able to. And what we're doing there is giving the students an example of a situation in which agreements could help, and then asking them to brainstorm what are some of the things she would need from herself in terms of her intentions. We talk about intentions. What are some things that she would need from her teacher? Like, what can the teacher set up as a condition in that library space of the debate club in order for her to be able to speak her truth? And then also finally, what does she need from her classmates? And those would be the agreements. What does everyone need to agree on to have that conversation and give her an opportunity to share? And the exercise of going through that, the reason that we chose to use a text and not just give them a hypothetical is that middle schoolers can be pretty concrete. And so giving them something really sort of like outside of themselves to wrestle with, as opposed to asking them to turn immediately inwards and apply the scenario to themselves, it yielded some really good agreements. So I would just encourage folks to find a text relevant to your curriculum and then mine that text for an opportunity to discuss what kinds of agreements would enable the characters in that story to talk to one another. And then from there, you can develop some agreements for your classroom.
I love that. And I think that perspective taking is one of those core skills that you learn when you're trying to connect across differences. So, and I know that you had mentioned some before, like giving each other permission for our first drafts, and then something similar to what Kanisha said about being able to draw that line, like knowing when it's not okay. Kanan.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other hat I wear is that I do a lot of facilitation training for our students, whether that be in higher ed or for teachers themselves. And I like to use an acronym because it's just easy to remember and seems to cover a lot of these really important points. And it's from Dr. Judy Pace's work. So I use the acronym ASPIRE often, and then what we will do is, depending on the group, their academic level or the topic or whatever it is, we will go in and negotiate some of those agreements. And usually it's to add things or to refine things, depending on what they need to know. So I'll share the acronym just so folks can see it. I don't know if I can share my screen here, but I'm gonna try. Can you see that? Great. So it is, this is the acronym. I share it all the time freely with everyone. The first one is assuming good intentions. That takes you a very, very long way with so many conversations. If something just seems awful or just you can't believe it, just assume that that person means well. Particularly helpful, I find, when I'm working with K-12 teachers who are really trying very hard and are really bumping up against a lot of different perspectives, parents, colleagues, students. S is speaking one at a time, so making and taking room. So we want to be mindful of sharing the space equitably as much as possible, for all voices to be heard, and finding ways to share it so that we lessen the hierarchy a bit in terms of that voice. Participating with perspective taking, like you just said, Becca, trying to, as best we can, sit with where someone else is coming from, using those I statements so we stay away from generalities that could also be provoking and provocative to say things like you people or all of you or your group. R is for respecting confidentiality and reasonable risks. So the reasonable risks are, of course, that braver space, but also respecting confidentiality so that others can feel more comfortable sharing their stories. And E, escuchar, because we want to be inclusive of linguistics differences, and also with empathy and compassion. So are we listening to understand, as Kanisha was saying earlier? And so we have this acronym, and we try to remember it in the beginning, we revisit it somewhere in the middle. And it's also the role of the facilitator, in my perspective, to sort of gently nudge everyone back to those agreements when necessary. And I think the one that I'm often reminding others of often is just the assuming of the good intentions, so that we can really listen. Because when someone says something that provokes something in us, we can stop listening very quickly because we assume they meant it. And then we talk a little bit about, intention versus impact. So sometimes you don't intend to say something harmful, but the impact is such that someone feels afraid or shut down. And so if we go back to assuming good intentions, we can do something restorative in that space to allow us to continue to try to understand each other. So that's one that we go to very often. But as I shared, sometimes we expand on that, or we might elaborate in this space. What does it mean to honor confidentiality? Or what does it mean to listen with empathy? And so forth and so on. So that's just one means that we have to make sure that there's something concrete to refer back to and relatively easy to remember.
I love those. Acronyms are wonderful. I still remember the one I used to remember what the planets were, so they can be very effective. Learning one about bridge building is a great one. We have conversation agreements at Living Room Conversations. Listen and be curious, show respect and suspend judgment, be authentic and welcome that from others. And I feel like in all of my experience in these sorts of conversations, the more you can ground it in personal experience, the better the conversation is. So when we start even citing facts and opinions, then our natural reaction is to push back and offer our own opinion. And you really allow yourself to sit in this space where you're perspective taking, where you're practicing curiosity when you're sharing your stories around a topic or an issue. And so in that spirit, we're going to go into breakout rooms, and we would love to hear from you. Sort of, what experiences do you have that are similar to what you heard from these panelists? What are things that might be different? Is there anything that you heard from the panel, or anything you wish you had heard, or additional information that you wanted, or potential obstacles you feel like you might face in doing this in your own community? And then just thinking about, how might you bring this to your community? What would it look like? What can you do to make that happen? We're going to go into the breakout rooms. Thomas is kindly putting them into the chat. Click on the link for the room that you would like to go to. He has great details about what those different rooms are. We'll be answering the same questions, so kind of allowing you this opportunity to practice some of these bridging skills and listening to others and reflecting on what the panelists said. On April 17th, we have the National Week of Conversation kicking off, and there are some opportunities that you have to engage now to lean in and try and practice this. We'll share links for resources for you to start being able to do this now, as well as a link so that we can learn from your experiences if you're already doing this, or if you decide to try it, we want to know how it goes. So all of that will be done in the breakout rooms. We won't come back to this room, so we'll kind of wrap it up from those breakout rooms. And so I just want to, while we're all together, really applaud you for showing up. It is so heartening to see people that choose to show up to events like this, to learn more about what we can do to help heal society, to learn more about what we can do to prepare students in the K-12 sector to really embrace these sorts of behaviors and skills, and how we can better model that for them. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to the panelists. I wish we had another hour so I could talk to all of you, but we will have to schedule that for another time. So go ahead and click on the link for the breakout room you would like to join.